Hi, friends, and welcome to the By Faith podcast. My name is Christine Hoover, and I'm so glad you're here. This season on By Faith, we're talking about the ins and outs of vocational ministry. Friends, I want to thank you for listening to this season. We're closing it out today with a special episode. Christian Audio made it possible for me to share the first 2 chapters of my book, How to Thrive as a Pastor's Wife, with you right here on the podcast. I hope it will give you a taste of the book, but even if you never pick it up, whether in paperback or audio form, I hope you'll be encouraged by these 2 chapters alone. The first chapter is called Locating You, and what you can't see in the audio version is a map my friend Haley drew for the book. Throughout the book, I use this landscape architectural drawing to illustrate what relationships must hold our priority and how to incorporate healthy boundaries and rhythms in your life in order to help you thrive. The second chapter is called You Are Anchored. It's meant to help you know and remember your identity as you serve the Lord as a pastor's wife. I do want to remind you that By Faith is evolving into the Ministry Wives podcast with Christine Hoover starting in mid-August. The good news is that if you've already subscribed to By Faith, you'll automatically see the Ministry Wives podcast show up in your feed then. If you're not subscribed, I invite you to do so right now so we can continue the conversation about all the ins and outs of ministry in August. All right, friends, let's get to it. Here are the first 2 chapters of my book, How to Thrive as a Pastor's Wife. Part 1, You. Chapter 1, Locating You. Our wedding anniversary is March 11th, 2000. So, of course, on March 11th, 2020, my husband and I planned a nice evening out at our favorite restaurant in Charlottesville to celebrate 20 years of marriage. We were looking forward to a long-awaited and long-saved-for trip 2 months later, but we couldn't let the date itself go by without reflecting on our 20 years together. Just before we left for dinner, my husband received a phone call. The school where our church meets on Sundays had temporarily closed its doors to both students and outsiders. Earlier that day, we'd marveled that March Madness and the NBA were canceling their games, that the local university had informed their students not to return from spring break. And now this too? All because of this strange new virus no one knew much about called COVID-19. March 11th, 2020, our wedding anniversary, was the day the world started shutting down. And it was also the day Kyle stepped into crisis leadership that we thought might last a few weeks, but that, as of this writing a year later, continues even now. For most church congregations and ministries, the year 2020 mixed a perilous cocktail of a pandemic, racial strife and nationwide protests, a contentious political environment, and many financial and mental health needs among congregants. For everyone, but especially pastors, 2020 was a year unlike any other. We didn't get to go on our anniversary trip in 2020, but in early 2021, we slipped away to a warm tropical location at what felt like God's perfect timing. In other words, we were running on fumes. Kyle was close to burnout after a year of crisis leadership, and frankly, our marriage was suffering. For the few months prior to our trip, God had been bringing what was in our hearts to the surface, and it wasn't pretty. But in some ways, I also felt vindicated, defended, and seen. I'd felt lost for a while, or rather, as if I'd been in a snow globe and someone had been shaking it endlessly. I'd held hurts close to my chest. I'd sensed a loss of connection to others and to myself. It had seemed as if nothing in my life or in our marriage was in its proper and peaceful place, but rather that we were running at top speed and getting nowhere. In the ways God was working, however, I knew He saw me. I couldn't locate myself in the swirl, but He had never lost me. Over and over, He reminded me that He was shepherding me and coaxed me to trust and follow Him. One of the areas I most felt lost was in relation to church and ministry. I knew my relationship to the church was off somehow, and I knew Kyle's relationship to his work was similarly off. So we spent endless hours on our trip dissecting what that off was and asking God to help us put the areas of our life together in their proper places. The visual picture I'm sharing with you developed out of one of our conversations. Toward the end of the trip, I told Kyle I was apprehensive about returning home, primarily because we'd had such a wonderful and restorative time away together, truly like a second honeymoon. I wasn't ready to return and share him with others. When we had this conversation, we were sitting in a gated patio outside our room, a beautiful area complete with palm trees waving in the breeze, a hammock, an outdoor breakfast nook, and a tiny private pool. In other words, paradise. Outside the gate, a serpentine sidewalk surrounded by more palm trees and tropical plants led toward the resort's main pool and restaurant. Attempting to explain my apprehension to Kyle, I pointed to the gate and said, "I feel as if returning home is like walking outside that gate together. The church staff, elders, and congregants are waiting for you just outside the gate with questions and needs, ready for your attention and time. I have your undivided attention on vacation, and then when we return home, we walk out that gate and I wave goodbye and release you to everyone else." That may have been how we'd done things previously, but we needed a new, healthier way of remaining together while also parenting, working, and fulfilling God's call on our life. For both of us, the analogy of the gate and our surrounding environs was like a light bulb flickering on in a dark room. Using the layout of our cabana, a place of joy and restoration, we mapped out where things should be moving forward in order to protect proper boundaries, thrive in marriage, be engaged with our kids, and also be purposeful in ministry. Like a mall directory, it was as if God said to me through the visual picture, "You are here. I see you. I've got you. I have you where I want you. I'll lead you. You're not alone. There is a better way forward for you and Kyle together." God was asking me to release fear, self-agenda, and self-protection. He was identifying and locating me, whispering into my heart, "Let me remind you who you are." He took me back and reoriented me around the lessons I'd been learning all along, lessons I now share with you. Chapter 2, You Are Anchored. Hoping to meet new people soon after we settled in Charlottesville, I volunteered for a women's committee at our local hospital and was required to attend a volunteer training meeting. New to the city and without a friend to my name, I headed into the meeting with eagerness and earnestness, ready to strike up a conversation with anyone who even glanced my way. I sat down at a table next to a woman who also happened to be new to town, which gave us immediate common ground and fueled great conversation. We volleyed the usual questions back and forth. How old are your kids? What do you do? Where are you from originally? In my mind, I'd already considered the potential outcome of this conversation, a new friend. And then I asked it. As soon as the question fell off my lips, my stomach clenched with regret because I knew she would politely extend the same question back to me, and then we'd step together into dangerous territory. What does your husband do? She answered and then returned it, but slightly off script. What brought you to town? My mind went on high alert. How was I going to answer her question without losing my new friend? I wasn't ashamed of Christ, why we moved to Charlottesville, or that my husband was a pastor. I simply knew the answer would turn the conversation either really awesome or really awkward in a matter of seconds, and I wouldn't know which way it would go until I put it out there. My husband is a pastor. Pause. We moved here to start a church. Pause. In our living room. Extended pause. Would you like to come? By the look on her face, she was apparently conjuring images in her mind of a group of misfits gathering in an eerily darkened room, possibly lit by candles, all of us drinking Kool-Aid and wearing weird clothing. Either that or she was replaying our conversation, trying to remember if she'd let loose any cuss words. But all she said was a flat, "Oh." I attempted to lightheartedly continue the conversation, but it was obviously over. I wanted to say to her, I'm not that kind of pastor's wife. Almost every ministry wife I encounter repeats some version of this sentiment. I'm not the typical pastor's wife. I think what we're trying to convey is that we are not a stereotype or some sort of trophy, perfectly put together but having no ministry or mind of our own. But the stereotype seems to loom largest in our own minds. We each enter ministry with an idea of what it means to be a pastor's wife, what we should do and how we should act. And if we were to dissect each of our individual ideas, there'd be some variance, but I imagine we'd find most of them soaked in high standards and expectations we'd hoisted onto our own shoulders. We bristle against the stereotype, certain God's not calling us to squeeze ourselves into some predetermined mold. But if not that, then what? What does it mean to be a pastor's wife? How must we think of ourselves? Pastor's wife is not your identity. I spent many years trying to figure out who I am and what I'm to do as a pastor's wife. It was as if I had been handed some sort of heavy mantle when we entered ministry, and I couldn't figure out how to wear it properly. So I copied the women around me whom I admired: the pastor's wife at the church down the street, the pastor's wife at my childhood church, and my fellow ministry wives at the church where we served. I jumped into ministry spots and opportunities I thought I should be doing, and I said yes to everything and everyone who came my way. I also tried to appear very spiritual and have all the right answers, because isn't that what pastors' wives do? In attempting to figure it all out, I finally realized I was trying to make pastor's wife my identity. I'd traded in disciple and dependent child of God and even wife and friend for a nebulous label of pastor's wife. I spent years willing myself to rise to the challenge of the persona, unaware I'd been the very one who'd put the ill-fitting mantle on myself. The mantle felt outsized and unmanageable because it was not my true God-given identity. Pastor's wife is a title, yes, but it's not an identity that defines who I am at the very core of my being, and it's not yours either. In saying this, I'm not trying to throw off a role God has given me, and I'm not trying to incite your defensiveness or apathy. I embrace and enjoy being a pastor's wife. Being married to a minister is an honor, sanctification on steroids, and a rewarding opportunity to love God by loving others. But it is not an identity by which I can live. It's simply the means by which I can serve others. In fact, I've discovered over the years that thinking of myself first as the pastor's wife, rather than seeing it as the means or opportunity by which I can serve, actually holds temptations that have tripped me up, caused me to sin, and inflicted pain on myself and others. There is overwhelming pressure in attempting to live up to a title. In contrast to a title, a true God-given identity is a weight not that we hold, but rather that holds us. An anchor for our souls. An anchor is any device for holding fast and securing firmly. Think of a boat resisting a current by dropping an anchor into the water. Do we in ministry not need something to secure us firmly and hold us fast as we navigate the rough waters of criticism, discouragement, blurred relational lines, and uncertainty? Do we not need a permanent core identity that calls to mind God's righteousness and provision, rather than a reliance on our own abilities? Do we not need an identity that can never be stripped away, no matter the circumstances or context we're in? Knowing who you are begins with knowing who you aren't. When I've tried to live up to the title of pastor's wife, I've been driven to perform rather than serve God. I've been driven to say yes to every need presented to me. I felt as if I had to be involved in everything at our church. I felt responsible to help my husband fix systems and people's hearts when they're broken. It's been my self-appointed job to make sure people are connected and connecting, both to the Lord and to one another. Did you notice my word choices? I have to say yes to every need. I'm responsible to fix hearts. It's my job. These word choices betray the belief that I should be able to do everything and be everything that is needed for the people around me. If I don't, I'm failing as the pastor's wife. I am not to have my own needs or weaknesses or limits. I'm to have all the gifts and all the abilities without fail. Can you relate? Do you feel the pressures bearing down on you to be all and do all for all? We must see these thoughts and pressures for what they are, a belief that we can be a type of Christ. I think this is a very common temptation for men and women in ministry because there are innate rewards in saving, rescuing, delivering, and being the one others look to and depend upon. We would never say that we are the Christ, but we push ourselves to attempt to imitate the incommunicable attributes of God: all-powerful, all-present, self-sufficient, without limits, self-existent, all-knowing, and in control of all things. Rather than imitating the communicable attributes of God we can and are told to imitate, such as his truth-telling, love, mercy, grace, and compassion. The very real truth is that we are not able to ease the sufferings of others. We are entirely unable to produce spiritual change in others, and we cannot be the Spirit of God to them. We are not the Christ. Any attempt to be Christ to others is a weight we are not made to handle, but this is what we attempt to do when we live according to a title rather than a God-given identity. I take this wording, "we are not the Christ," from John the Baptist. The crowds were coming to him, trying to identify and categorize him at the point in time when Jesus' ministry began to take shape. They wanted, in other words, to title him. They asked, "Who are you?" John 1:19, attempting to locate him according to what they knew of God's story. His place in the kingdom story is one we know well. John the Baptist began his ministry after 400 years of God's silence, a time barren of his prophets and his visible activity. John's birth was heralded by the angel Gabriel. He was tasked with calling God's people to repentance, and he developed a large following in a short time. In other words, John the Baptist was important. He was a strong leader with an impressive resume, the cool megachurch pastor of his time. That's how we think of him, and the crowds had developed certain ideas about him, but how did he think of himself? What identity anchored him? He confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Verses 20 through 23. John rejected any title or identity not clearly given to him by God. In essence, he said, "I am not Elijah, and I am not the prophet. Those roles, those identities, those responsibilities aren't mine." He recognized he had a very specific calling from God. This calling was to a specific people, at a specific time, in a specific place, for a specific purpose. It was not to be a savior or a rescuer or to fulfill the entire mission all by himself. He was only called to be faithful with his specific task, to make straight the way of the Lord. We'll talk about calling in the next chapter, but for now, consider how silly it would have been for John to say, "Why, yes, I am the Christ," and inflate his own importance and calling. What a weight and burden he would have taken on that he was not capable of carrying. Yet how often do I think of myself as a type of Christ to those I am serving? How often do you? We know we're not the actual Christ, but we're tempted to believe that we have to act as if we were. We put so much pressure and expectations on ourselves. If I say the exact right thing in a difficult situation, I can save a person from going down a path of destruction. If I respond to an unbeliever in the exact right way, they'll be saved. With the right words and actions, I can somehow remove a church member's grief and pain. We must reject inflated self-importance. We are not the Christ. The anchor of identity that holds us. Did you notice that the priests and Levites kept asking John the Baptist to identify himself? They wanted to know his title, and they repeatedly offered him suggestions of who they wanted him to be. This is the same battle we fight. As ministry wives, not only do we struggle internally to think of ourselves rightly, but there are many who want to identify us according to their ideas and categories. Everyone we serve has an idea of what their leaders should be and do. Some will express disappointment that we're not what they hoped, and some will want to elevate us beyond what we actually are. The temptation for every ministry leader is to endlessly spin our wheels, trying to win over the disappointed while maintaining our elevated status in the eyes of the pedestal builders. What more then can we learn from John the Baptist? John 3 records a new group coming to him with a concern. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing and all are going to him." Verses 25 through 26. John had obviously communicated who he was and who he wasn't because they regurgitated his words back to him, calling him a witness bearer. However, he'd evidently been such a good witness bearer that he'd gathered a following. In fact, this passage tells us he had his own disciples, but many of them were now leaving the umbrella of John's teaching and leadership and transferring their allegiance to Jesus. Apparently, the disciples who remained with John the Baptist wanted to protect his numbers, platform, reputation, and ministry. They wanted to make much of him. The same pitfall awaits us in ministry. We will be tempted not only to inflate our importance and abilities, but also to let others do so. People seek wise counsel and godly leadership from us, which is well and good and not the issue. The issue is how we respond to their seeking. Will we point them to the real Christ, or will we allow them to believe we have capabilities beyond our capabilities, or to attribute the power displayed in our life and words to us and not to the Christ? What was John's response to this temptation of letting others exalt him? A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. Verses 27 through 30. John would not let others attribute qualities to him that solely belonged to Christ. And in speaking of his identity, he gives us an anchoring identity as well. First and foremost, John said there is a Christ, and his name is Jesus. He is the light of the world, the groom who came for his bride, and our Savior and Messiah. And he is the reason John's ministry existed. The Bible describes his ministry as bearing witness about Christ, John 1, 6 through 8, standing as a friend of the groom as he vows his love to the bride, and rejoicing in Christ himself. This ministry, John said, was received, given to him from heaven. In other words, heaven had written his identity, not the religious leaders, not his followers, and not even John himself. He served on heaven's orders alone. The same is true for each of us. We are not the Christ, but we bear witness of the Christ. We rejoice in the Christ we proclaim. We point to the Christ, and we exalt the Christ. This is great freedom for us in ministry. Like John the Baptist, we are called to a specific people in a specific place with specific gifts for a specific purpose. We take our cues from heaven, not from our own or anyone else's ideas of what we should be or what our title means. We're simply called to be faithful to shine a light toward the light of the world, using whatever gifts we've been given, as well as to stand as witnesses to the union of Christ with those we love and serve. We are not marrying others to ourselves. We are inviting them to be married to Christ. We're not the center of attention. How awkward it would be if all the attention were to turn toward a bridesmaid at a wedding. How inappropriate if one of the groomsmen started making eyes at the bride. We would call it not only inappropriate, but adulterous. The fact that we are not the center of attention is, in John's words, something to rejoice in. Why? Because it speaks to our true identity. Like those we serve, we are also married to the bridegroom, which means we're secure in the love of Christ and don't need the approval or validation of those around us. Paul Tripp says it like this: the most important encounter in ministry is not the person's encounter with us, but his encounter with Christ. Our job is simply to set up that encounter so that God would help people seek his forgiveness, comfort, restoration, strength, and wisdom. It's not our title of pastor's wife that anchors us, but rather our identity that does. And what is our identity? We are servants of God for the benefit of others. 2 Corinthians 4:5. We may be introduced by a church member as their pastor's wife or to the sending church as the missionary on furlough, but that is not who we are at the core. Those titles just tell others in what capacity we serve God. Our identity as servant of God is the foundation of all we do. Christ died for us, therefore we are alive to God, not to ourselves. 2 Corinthians 5:14-15. We're not our own, but rather belong to Him. We pour out our life for God's pleasure. A servant to a servant. When we first entered ministry, I thought, to be very honest, that it would be a position of honor, that it would in some ways be glamorous. I had no concept in my mind that I'd have to get my hands dirty, that I would in many ways feel invisible, and that the core and goal of ministry is laying down one's life for the sake of others. I was in for a rude awakening, a good rude awakening, I might add. In my ongoing struggle to lay myself down and serve, I find it helpful to return to passages that describe Jesus and His ministry on earth. When we consider Him in Philippians 2:6-7, we read that Christ, who though He was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied Himself by taking the form of a servant. He took the form, the identity of a servant. That is who Jesus is, and that is who I am to be. Not someone seeking honor, respect, admiration, and approval. Not someone looking for a way into the spotlight. Not someone looking for appreciation or letting others do the grunt work. I am prone to thinking more about who is doing what for me, how that person at church responded to me in a hurtful way, or who will engage me on Sunday morning or invite me into their social circle. But Jesus not only said He came to serve rather than be served, Matthew 20:28, He also said it is more blessed to give to others than to receive, Acts 20:35. He said life and ministry will be better, more satisfying, and more joyful for us if we focus not on what people are doing for us, but rather what we can do for them in His name and for His glory. Why would it be better? Proverbs 11:25 says, "Whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered." Isn't there a satisfaction we feel when the Lord leads us to meet a need or give an encouraging word? That's the watering Proverbs talks about, the joy of being used by God as His servant. This verse doesn't mean we get exactly what we give. It means we enjoy the specific happiness that comes from obeying God's command and showing love to others. This is the specific happiness Jesus Himself experienced. Hebrews 12:2. I think it also puts us in a position of trusting God to meet our needs and looking at Him with eager anticipation of how He will give us what we need. Loving others, Jesus says, is for our joy. Thinking of ourselves, then, is not going to serve us well in ministry. It will only make us bitter and unable to receive with thanksgiving what is offered us. When we live according to a false identity, anything other than a beloved servant of God, we're weighed down with tremendous burdens rather than held by an anchor. It's the difference between ministry resting upon our abilities or upon God's. And reliance on self is a draining business because self is innately weak. There are high highs when things are going well, but when we face criticism, obstacles, or discouragement, we fall into very low lows. Are you currently weighed down under a heavy mantle you've put on yourself or under the lofty expectations of others? The expectations may be real, but the gospel of Jesus Christ lifts those burdens from you. In His mercy, He has removed your sin. In His grace, He has given you everything you need for life and godliness. 2 Peter 1:3. You don't have to complete any checklist or meet the expectations of others in order to receive or maintain what He lovingly gives. You are loved, so much so that His love identifies and characterizes who you are. When you live and serve as the beloved woman you are, you find yourself able to constantly pour out, but never be truly emptied. Thanks so much for listening, not just to this episode, but to the whole season. If you would like to get the whole audiobook or get it in paperback form, I've put links to several retailers in my show notes. And of course, you can always head to my website I've created just for pastors' wives, howtothriveasapastorswife.com. Okay, friends, I'll see you in August. Until then, keep walking forward by faith.